This story is called My Anarchist Neighbor. It's from a book of short stories from the Key Peninsula called The Woodpecker Menace, written by Ted Olinger. Me. I was behind the wheel of my neighbor's truck, spinning donuts on my lawn, when I realized that I had wasted my life. The crisis began when I asked to borrow his rototiller. It was, I thought, a harmless request. Our new front lawn was nothing but a wide, sprawling weed bed that tormented my sleep. With spring's ever-gradual arrival, I decided to rip it out and begin again. Why don't you see if the neighbor has a rototiller we can borrow? My wife was determined that at least one of us meet the man at the end of our gravel road. This was just another excuse. In fact, we were his new neighbors. Our small family had just that winter moved to the rural outcropping in South Puget Sound that is the Key Peninsula, and I had already expended tremendous effort into not meeting the neighbor. I knew by reputation that he had enjoyed a long career on the peninsula as some kind of survivalist logger, trading wood for tobacco, alcohol, and ammunition. Well into his 70s, he lived alone in an aging trailer with a detached outhouse and no electricity, plunked down in the middle of a large compound patrolled by 3 chihuahuas and a flightless cockatiel. The perimeter was a blasted battlefield of wood fragments where he'd hand-split massive rounds of timber for decades. The ground was littered with the relics of his trade: axes, wedges, mauls, spools of rusted cable, bent and broken chain hoists, and the carcasses of half a dozen vehicles shrouded in plastic blue tarp. All of this was sprawled under the shadow of an enormous American flag, which he dutifully hoisted every morning, upside down. A man like that must own a rototiller, my wife insisted. But one look at his compound told me all I needed to know. I had seen the man himself occasionally parked on some roadside shoulder, rear doors of his rusting Suburban flung open to display firewood piled to the liner. Leaning against the rear bumper would be a piece of plywood with the words, "Dry Mad Fur, $100. He would be in the driver's seat, his face in a newspaper and a black fur hat more suited to a Cossack jammed on his head. He would sometimes get a good look at me, too, his vehicle listing under the weight of wood as he went grinding up our road, his Cossack hat just visible above the steering wheel. If I were outside, he'd hold up a hand in a motionless wave that I took to mean, "Stay where you are," or "Make no sudden moves." This did not bother me. Then there were the poems. They appeared mysteriously, left on the shelves of local stores or nailed into prominent roadside trees. A selection could often be found pinned to the bulletin board of our community center, inviting readers to take a copy. Handwritten in clear block letters, they drew inspiration from a range of topics, but invariably attacked some corrosive political influence on society with a fiery sonnet rhyme scheme. I did not connect these seditious screeds with our neighbor until I observed him plastering one to a pump at our local gas station, a lonely but important outpost due to its situation on one of the 3 routes off our peninsula, and therefore a good place to reach a large audience. I recognized at once the distinctive block letters swarming the photocopy page with quatrains of righteous fury. Titled, "Baby Bush Bombs Baghdad," it began, "Our President Warrior Wannabe, leading a nation content with its cud, surrounded by lying neocon sleaze, gets us drunk on oil and blood." Like all of his work, this too was signed, "Your Anarchist Neighbor." "Well," said my wife, "maybe he's got a plow." On the day I finally swung open the gate guarding his property, he was sitting on a stump in front of his trailer, sharpening the teeth of a blackened saw chain with what looked like a petrified rat's tail. He was surrounded by islands of newspapers and notepads anchored by half-empty coffee mugs and the kind of decorative ceramic ashtrays once found on every bar in America. Instead of cigarettes, they were full of pencil stubs and exhausted pens. "Rototiller." He rolled the word around in his mouth like a piece of rotten meat. "I knew you'd come down here sometime, but I didn't think it'd be for something like that." He gazed unblinking at me from under the furry black battering ram of his Cossack hat. I could tell at a glance this man had led an eventful life. His gravelly voice was a good fit for a face well seasoned by the elements, with many lines orbiting a large nose that looked to have been broken and set badly many times. His legs, his hands, and his dogs were all stained with burnt oil and sawdust. An old plaid shirt and jeans hung off his lean, stubby build by way of both fading yellow logger suspenders and a thick leather belt, while shoots of wild gray hair stuck out from under his hat. But the eyes in the shadow of that hat shone with a certainty and kindness that gave him an air of nobility. It was something I would later find akin to the hard and regal madronas he sometimes salvaged for firewood. Like them, he was tough and slow-burning, but once the fire was going, it gave off a lot of heat. "I am not in possession of a row-tow tiller at this time," he said with sympathy, "but I believe I can help you." He recommended the Bourbon. This was that same 30-year-old, 18-foot-long, four-wheel drive, solid steel urban assault vehicle masked with rust stains and pine tar in which he patrolled the peninsula looking for trees to fell. It boasted a set of salvaged monster truck tires that would have shamed a tank. He directed me to a stepladder leaning against the passenger side door. "You gotta climb up into it through the window. The door's been stuck since George W. stole Florida." If there was a connection, he didn't say, but added that the electric windows did not work either. The broken stump of an ignition key lay in the ashtray. The key's tip was buried deep in the ignition. "Yep, that was W2, he said. "What a day." I was surprised when the engine roared to life and alarmed when my neighbor climbed through the passenger window after me, first passing in his mug of coffee. "Put the stub back in the ashtray or it'll just fall out." He didn't use the ashtray anymore, he said, at least not for cigarettes. "Had to quit smoking last year after my heart attack. Then got the swine flu in hospital and pneumonia when I got out. I'll never do that again." He shook his head. "Do what?" "Quit smoking." I inched up the gravel road between our homes and into my yard, maneuvering between large stones that lined the road's edge every few yards. "Careful of those damn rocks," said my neighbor. "They were a bitch to put right the first time." "What do you mean?" "My old dad and me lined the lanes around the farm here with rocks we cleared from the fields. It was my grandpa's idea, the bastard. Glacial erratics, they're called. Good name." He scowled at the row of granite stones, each about twice the size of a bowling ball. "Now, put it in low 4, lock up the brakes, then gun it and don't let go." The vehicle lurched forward like an angry bull at the end of a chain, the massive tires pawing up doormat-sized chunks of soil. I gunned it again, and the rear end spun around, sending up more doormats. "Now, that's how we rototill on the Key Peninsula." He drained his coffee. "Time was I'd have some bourbon in the Bourbon for a job like this," he said. "But I quit drinking in '73 after I challenged Richard Nixon to a fistfight." He pointed to the few gray and twisted apple trees behind my house. "I used to climb all these trees of yours before they set me to picking. They were pretty good then. Any good now?" I admitted the trees seemed to produce nothing but hard green stones that failed to ripen, and that I did nothing to help them along. "Well, you gotta trim them and feed them, and you gotta spray every year. We used sulfur, killed everything that didn't belong, and stained everything that did this gold and yellow. Stank all to hell and back, but goddamn, those trees were beautiful." Then he asked if I had heard about the bear. Everyone on the KP knew about the black bears that had been raiding overstuffed bird feeders and unsecured trash cans all spring. He reminded me that a bear had recently barged into the 302, our local tavern. "The bartender shot it. Then he had to call the police to come shoot it some more." Another bear had attacked a jogger in rural parkland before that. And now he knew there was one near our homes, dining on our early berries. The only animals I'd seen or heard were the stray dogs that commuted up and down the gravel road all day. "Dogs?" he snorted, stretching an extra syllable out of the word. "It's a goddamn bear." And then his voice went up an octave. "And there it is!" I caught a glimpse of a shining black shape disappearing into some blackberry vines. It was trailed by a few of the local stray dogs, barking like lunatics, although from a discreet distance. I had seen bears in the wild before, and there was no mistaking that glistening sheen of fur. Seeing one in my yard brought home the images of a bear breaking into an occupied building, or mauling a jogger. My neighbor seemed to share that vision. "Let's go," he said. Rolling forward attracted the attention of the barking stray dogs, which chased us instead of the bear. I laid on the horn to clear a path, and the engine died. "Oh, hell!" shouted my neighbor. I turned the broken key in the ignition, but nothing happened. "Honking kills the engine!" "How's that?" "The wiring's shot, and the horn shorts it out. Why do you think the doors don't unlock?" "I thought that was Bush's fault." "Well, now we need new fuses." My neighbor eyed the barking strays, all large, mangy, and hostile. He did not appear eager to climb out. He popped open the glove compartment and shuffled through a bundle of papers. "I used to keep a pistol in here for times like this, but I stopped carrying during the Reagan regime. I was so mad all the time, afraid I'd use it." He flipped through 2 or 3 dozen pages of that neat block handwriting. "Wrote a poem about that, in fact. I've got it here somewhere." He read one, and then another, page after page, of imperial presidents and the spines they lack, of the corporate baron and toady bureaucrat, of the perverse and the progressive, of economies recessive, of the people's plea for jobs and growth, of the just and the unjust, and the rain that falls on both. Like Dante, he followed the monsters to their den, but then like Quixote, he would fight them with his pen. The sun was low in the sky and the stray dogs long gone by the time we finished his collection. I wanted a cigarette, though I didn't smoke. I also wanted a drink, possibly armed with a pistol, something suitable for scaring stray dogs. We decided that the danger had passed, and I climbed through the passenger window and onto the freshly minted moonscape that had been my dead lawn. The bear emerged from the blackberries. It was huge, darkly glistening in the evening sun, its tail wagging like a giant metronome. "What the hell is that?" said my neighbor. As the enormity of our situation hit him, he yelled, Bad dog, go home!" and lumbered away, unconcerned. Lacking cigarettes, liquor, or a handgun, it seemed appropriate to at least invite our neighbor in for more coffee. "That was a really fat dog," I said. "Looked like a pregnant sow," he barked, then stood still in the entryway of our modest home and gazed about as if at some natural wonder. "You know, I've been going by this house for 30 years, and I have never been inside." I spent the rest of that spring slowly dragging the chunks of torn lawn into a compost pile, which my 6-year-old son would then drag away for his own use, constructing a sodden earth fort. I planted pounds of grass and flowers and sprayed our aging apple trees with something that smelled faintly of rotten eggs. Our neighbor would stick his head out the bourbon's one open window and inhale deeply of the sulphury breeze. "Hoo-ah! Smells like home!" Stacks of firewood began to appear in front of our house. There was the odd jar of pickled beets, or a bunch of spinach with bits of mud still warm from his garden. There were newspaper clippings, often punctuated with indignant red arrows or disbelieving question marks. And, always, there were poems. I made a point of visiting the compound every week or two, usually with my 6-year-old in tow. He was mesmerized by the yipping, oil-stained chihuahuas in the yard full of artifacts from this woodsman's life. If he picked up a branch to throw for the dogs, our neighbor would pronounce, "That's cedar. Good for starting." My son would hold up another. "Madrona, which you have to split right after you fell." But when my son would point to a standing tree, our neighbor would reel off something like, "I was thumbing my way home from San Diego after the war when I picked up this acorn in the redwoods and put it in my pocket because I thought I might need to eat it for my supper. But then I made it home, and I washed my pants and hung them out to dry and never saw them again. Thought a bear ate them. Then, before you know it, there's this sapling wearing my pants. Of course, they eventually split and fell off." It was hard to read my son's expression as he absorbed these dispatches from a world where bears ate laundry and acorns grew too big for their britches. But he seldom let me visit the compound without being at my side. It dawned on me only later that, growing up with no surviving grandparents, he must have felt some unfamiliar comfort whenever we were in our neighbor's presence. Our neighbor's grandfather had homesteaded 160 acres here at the end of the 19th century, He cleared as much timber as he could to farm several large fields before succumbing to tuberculosis during the Great Depression. Our neighbor had grown up working the farm, growing hops, picking apples and berries when he wasn't rolling stones out at the fields. When the Korean War started, he walked off the peninsula and joined the army, determined never to return. If he was going to do back-breaking work, he decided it would be for himself. Yet, decades later, he had returned to the woods he knew best. When I asked how that came about, he looked at me hard before answering. "It was that Monica Lewinsky conundrum," he said. "My God, we put this man in office and, well, it was enough to start me drinking again, I'll just say that." He showed me a half-built sailboat being consumed by the blackberry vines behind his trailer. Maybe 20 feet long and 4 or 5 feet wide, it looked like the decaying wooden skeleton of a misshapen box. "That is what a broken dream looks like," he said. "We were living in Tacoma when my wife threw me out over the drinking. So I thought, I'll come back here. There was no other place to go. I thought, I'll just build myself this little scow and live on that and fish for my supper. It is a scow, by the way, very simple, and I had all the wood in the world. What happened?" "Life," he said. He dug a couple of fingers into his plaid shirt breast pocket, fumbling for cigarettes he no longer carried. Then he looked at me. "Don't let it happen to you." His family had been selling the farm off in parcels of second or third growth for years, including the plat where our own small house sat surrounded by stands of towering trees. He had managed to hang on to a sliver of the original homestead, working on his boat at the end of the road he'd helped build, watching houses and families grow up as trees came down. But much of his former land remained undeveloped, and when we walked through those woods together that last summer, he showed me forgotten pastures of tall grass, the ruins of a hidden fruit-drying shed, and the broken ranks of ragged apple trees with branches too warped and tangled to bear any more fruit. New apples were just beginning to ripen on the old trees behind our house that autumn when our neighbor died. There was to be a viewing at the wake. I assumed I would go alone, but my son refused to let me visit our neighbor this last time without him. He clung to my hand as we entered the outer room of the funeral home and into a crowd of plaid shirts and fur hats, suspenders worn with belts, and coffee mugs filled with things other than coffee. I picked a mug up off the table, and a man I knew only by sight edged toward me. He wore a faded aloha shirt under suspenders topped by an aging tweed jacket, and sported a yellowing beard he hadn't trimmed since, I imagined, the Reagan regime. "Guess he went to bed and never woke up." He motioned with his coffee mug to the next room. "Didn't figure him for dying in his sleep." "No, I didn't think we got to do that anymore." He fixed one of his large gray eyes on me while the other wandered the room. Then he produced an unlabeled bottle from his jacket pocket and tipped some of its contents into my mug. "Here's looking up your old address," he said. He kept his good eye on me for a moment, measuring the effects of his moonshine. He tasted strongly of smoldering corn cobs and broken dreams. When I did not go blind or pass out, he gestured to the crowd with his mug. "We talk poetry sometimes, you know, politics, some of us, down at 302, if you're interested." In the next room, our friend lay alone and uncharacteristically silent. His enormous American flag was on a podium next to him, folded into the traditional triangle. Upon it were his white and blue ribbon Korean War service medals, including the Army Good Conduct Award. His face had been shaved closer than it ever was in life, and his Cossack's hat was pulled low over his eyes, as if he were napping. He wore a new plaid flannel shirt under his faded logger suspenders, and in his breast pocket was a fresh notepad and sharpened pencil. My son pointed. "What's that for?" he whispered. "So he can keep writing poetry." "In heaven?" I hesitated. "Very likely," I said. When we returned home late in the afternoon, I passed through the house to the backyard to clear my head. I had a vague craving for cigarettes and more moonshine. I sat on the deck and watched a butterfly carried by the breeze over our newly green lawn and into an apple tree. Then I saw someone's arm reach up to touch it. The butterfly drifted, and again someone reached up to it. I crept across the yard until I could make out the movement. A young black bear lay on its back, under the low branches, lazily swatting at an apple until it fell. He snapped it up with his snout, ran his tongue around his teeth, and yawned. Then he stretched a paw toward the butterfly floating above him, not swatting, but reaching.